Welcome. About a year ago, back in around January of 2010, I was at a conference in Austin, Texas. And at this conference, Dan Wheeler, who was one of the founders of Dimensional Fund Advisors and really one of the pioneers of bringing to the marketplace the implementation of modern portfolio theory, spoke. Now, I'm not here to talk about that perspective of what Dan Wheeler has done, but really talk about something he did to start his presentation, which had an impact on me and I think will help some of you out there. And he started with giving what he called a history lesson. And the history lesson and the purpose of this history lesson was to help us and people kind of just put things in perspective. So I'm going to share this history lesson with you and maybe out there to help some people put a little bit more positive spin on how they view things that are going on in our society, in the world, and economy today. So back in the 1910s to the 1920s, as a society, we went through World War I. In addition to that, there was a huge flu epidemic throughout the country in which 30 million people died. 40% of the population alone in Philadelphia died from the flu epidemic. Then in the 1920s to 1930s, we had Prohibition, which is not one of the brightest eras in American history. Then from 1930s to 1940s, we had the Great Depression, which part of that was a huge stock market crash in 1929. We had unemployment as high as 25% and 33% in some cities. Then 1940s to 1950s, World War II, where we had really almost two philosophical beliefs of a dictatorship versus what some will call a free society at battle here. We had the Nazis of Germany. We had communist Japan, and where millions and millions of people died through this world, in that World War. And again, lots of devastation occurred during that era. Then in the 1950s to 1960s, actually was one of the first decades of prosperity, real prosperity without anything major significantly going on in society. So it was a good period of prosperity. There was racism, which was prevalent in that decade. And also a lot of pollution was prevalent that decade, but overall it was a period of prosperity. Then 1960s to 1970s, we had the Vietnam War. We had riots throughout the United States. We also had some significant assassinations which had a dramatic impact on us as Americans. We had JFK was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then 1970s to 1980s, we had a recession, a really bad recession, now which some have compared this recent recession to, and some people can argue was a lot worse back in the 70s. We had double-digit inflation. We had mortgage rates at 17%. Just imagine what your mortgage payments would have been in that type of environment. You also back then had an oil shock or oil crisis. That, as a young adult, that's the one part of the 70s from an economic standpoint or a global standpoint that I do recall was the long lines at the gas station for people to get gas. Then, from that point on, from 1980 to the 2000s, mid-2000s, we had a huge period of prosperity. And why is this important? Well, it's significant because many of us, that's all we know. That's all we knew. For me as a young adult growing up in the 80s, I just knew in the mid-2000s all I knew was prosperity. And then the baby boomers, our parents, were raising their families in a huge period of prosperity. And as we approach now the mid-2000s, which we are having adversity, we're having high inflation from our perspective, we're having wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and unrest in the Middle East, we're having lots of negative, bad things going on. I think it's helpful for us to realize again this history lesson that during the 80s to the mid-2000s, most of us, our mindsets and how we feel about what's going on today, our perspective were created during a huge period of prosperity. That when you look at other decades, the majority of other decades, what we're experiencing now for the first time is a period of adversity. But from a perspective standpoint, I sometimes still today always think about this history lesson and think, wow, could you just imagine what it would have been like growing up during World War II, or all those assassinations, all those negative things that really were going on. So really, amongst all this doom and gloom out there, hopefully this little history lesson has helped some of you out there put things in perspective and look at things in a more positive light as we go through what we are now experiencing some for the first time adversity in our economic and global lives going forward. Thank you.